Imagine this. December 1938. Across Europe, Jewish families are desperate, their children clutching small suitcases, their parents begging for any chance of escape. In Britain, history remembers one man, Nicholas Winton, as the savior of hundreds of children. But here is the untold truth. Winton was never alone. Behind him stood an army of ordinary Britons. Activists, teachers, volunteers, religious groups, even politicians, who made the impossible possible. Their names are less famous, their stories less celebrated, but without them, the Kindertransport would never have worked. This is their story. It began after Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938. Across Germany and Austria, synagogues burned, businesses were destroyed, and Jewish families were terrorized. For many, the realization was unavoidable. Life under the Nazis had become not just unbearable, but deadly. Refuge was the only hope. International governments debated, sympathized, but mostly hesitated. In Britain, the government faced pressure. Would they open their doors to thousands of Jewish children? Would they take in young refugees, even as the storm of war loomed? The decision, when it came, was not inevitable. It was won by voices of compassion inside Britain, citizens and campaigners who refused to remain silent. One of the earliest advocates was Eleanor Rathbone, a member of Parliament who had long fought for human rights and refugee causes. Rathbone, often described as the MP for refugees, raised her voice in Westminster, pressing her colleagues to act. She spoke not of politics, but of humanity. Children's lives were at stake, and delay meant death. But speeches alone could not save lives. Action was needed, and it came from unexpected quarters. One of the most important forces behind the Kindertransport was the Society of Friends, the Quakers. These quiet, deeply committed volunteers did not seek recognition. They organized trains, raised funds, and coordinated logistics with astonishing dedication. People like Bertha Bracy, a Quaker activist, became vital links in the chain of rescue. Bracy was not a politician nor a soldier, but her ability to mobilize communities and organize the details of safe passage was extraordinary. She spent endless hours negotiating with officials, filling out paperwork and writing letters. For every child who boarded a train, there were stacks of documents, visas and permits, all pushed through by determined civilians. Another central body was the Refugee Children's Movement, RCM, formed in Britain shortly after Kristallnacht. The RCM became the heart of the Kindertransport effort. Its volunteers were teachers, social workers, and ordinary citizens. They collected donations, persuaded families to host refugee children, and managed the overwhelming task of matching thousands of frightened children with British homes. Imagine the scenes, town halls filled with volunteers sorting through piles of forms. People lining up to register as foster parents, others donating clothes and food for children they had never met. And here is where the story becomes truly powerful. The Kindertransport was not just a story of policy, nor of one man's heroism. It was the story of communities opening their doors, of ordinary Britons deciding that they could and would take responsibility for children who had nowhere else to go. Families who had little to spare nevertheless made room in their homes. Strangers took in boys and girls who spoke no English, who arrived bewildered, carrying perhaps a single toy or photograph. These acts of compassion, multiplied by thousands, created a movement strong enough to defy indifference. Even Nicholas Winton himself, working tirelessly in Prague, depended entirely on this network back in Britain. He could organize transport, prepare lists, and find children in need. But without allies in London, without the Refugee Children's Movement, and the Quakers ready to receive those children, his efforts would have collapsed. His allies arranged the visas, provided guarantees to the Home Office, and ensured that when each train arrived, there were homes waiting. The scale of the operation was immense. Between December 1938 and the outbreak of war in September 1939, nearly 10,000 children were rescued and brought to Britain. They arrived at Liverpool Street Station in London, their faces anxious and hopeful. At the platform, volunteers greeted them, guided them, comforted them. For many of these children, it was the last time they ever saw their parents. The emotional weight of that reality was carried not only by the children, but also by the British families who took them in, suddenly becoming guardians to lives scarred by loss. It is easy looking back to imagine this rescue as inevitable, as if the Kindertransport was a natural act of compassion, but it was not. It required relentless persuasion, fundraising and organization by civilians who were not required to act, but chose to. Without these allies, without this civilian movement, the story of Nicholas Winton would be a footnote, a failed attempt. With them, it became one of the most remarkable humanitarian efforts in British history. And yet, many of these names remain forgotten. Bertha Bracy is known only to a handful of historians. Eleanor Rathbone is remembered in certain circles, but not celebrated widely. The countless volunteers of the refugee children's movement remain nameless. This anonymity does not diminish their heroism, it magnifies it. They did not act for recognition. They acted because children's lives were at stake. That is the real power of the Kindertransport story. Not the myth of a lone savior, but the truth of a collective heroism. Ordinary citizens, united by compassion, moved mountains. Their quiet determination turned political hesitation into action, and their willingness to open their homes turned tragedy into survival. And so, as we remember Nicholas Winton, we must also remember his allies in Britain. The men and women who stood beside him, often unseen but always essential. Together they proved that when humanity stands against hatred, even the smallest acts, signing a form, writing a letter, opening a door, can change the course of history. Behind every child who arrived safely in Britain, there were invisible armies of paperwork, negotiations, and endless nights of planning. The Kindertransport was not only about trains crossing borders, it was about the quiet, tireless work of civilians who battled bureaucracy with pens, telephones, and determination. These men and women were not soldiers, yet their battlefield was equally demanding. Desks piled with applications, government offices filled with reluctance, and deadlines dictated by the looming threat of Nazi expansion. One of the central forces in this struggle was the Refugee Children's Movement, or RCM. Formed in late 1938, immediately after the violence of Kristallnacht, the RCM became the nerve center of the entire Kindertransport operation. It had no official government funding, no pre-existing structure, and no guarantee of success. What it had instead were volunteers, teachers, social workers, members of churches and synagogues, people driven not by duty, but by compassion. They began by raising money, organizing donations, and establishing an office in London that quickly became the heart of the rescue effort. The British government, while eventually agreeing to admit refugee children, had imposed strict conditions. No public funds would be used for their upkeep. Each child required a private guarantee of 50, a large sum at the time, ensuring that the child would not become a burden on the state. For the RCM, this was a daunting challenge. If thousands of children were to be rescued, then thousands of guarantees needed to be secured. Volunteers went door to door, held church collections, and wrote appeals in newspapers. Middle-class families contributed, wealthy benefactors gave generously, and working-class households often donated what little they could. Slowly, painfully, the funds accumulated. Among the most determined figures in this work was Bertha Bracy, a Quaker who had already spent years supporting German refugees. Bracy's organizational skills and unshakable persistence turned her into one of the most important, though least remembered, architects of the Kindertransport. She coordinated with officials in Germany, arranged paperwork with the British Home Office, and oversaw the placement of children once they arrived. Racy described the work as a constant race against time. Every delay meant another child at risk of being trapped behind Nazi borders. To understand the magnitude of this task, imagine the sheer logistics. A single transport required not only seats on a train, but also travel documents, exit permits, visas, and often bribes for local officials. In Britain, volunteers had to confirm foster families, arrange reception committees at train stations, and ensure that children were transported safely to their new homes. A mistake in a document could mean weeks of delay, or worse, a denied visa. Volunteers spent long nights in dim offices, typing lists, filing applications, and sending cables back and forth across Europe. The urgency was relentless, but so was their commitment. The Quakers, with their tradition of humanitarian service, played an outsized role. Their offices became hubs of coordination, their members acting as couriers, organizers, and negotiators. They worked alongside Jewish relief organizations, Protestant and Catholic groups, and secular charities. This was perhaps the most remarkable feature of the Kindertransport. It cut across lines of faith and class. It was a rare moment in history when Britain's divisions were set aside, at least temporarily, for a common moral cause. At Liverpool Street Station in London, the first trains began arriving in December 1938. The children stepped off in small groups, carrying paper tags around their necks, their few belongings clutched tightly. Waiting for them on the platform were RCM volunteers, many of them young women who worked tirelessly to keep order amid the chaos. They comforted children, reassured anxious hosts, and sometimes improvised when placements fell through. Each arrival was a triumph, but also a reminder of the immense responsibility that remained. For Nicholas Winton in Prague, the link to Britain was lifeline and anchor. His lists of children, prepared under pressure and with urgency, would have meant nothing without allies in London, ready to receive them. The RCM provided that essential backbone. They processed his lists, secured the necessary paperwork, and coordinated with families who had agreed to foster. Winton was the point of origin, but the RCM was the machinery that turned plans into reality. The stories of the volunteers themselves reveal the human dimension of this effort. There were women who gave up their jobs to work full-time for the RCM without pay. Clerks who spent evenings after their regular work filling out forms. Retired men who acted as escorts, riding the trains with frightened children to ensure they reached safety. Each task, however small, was part of a vast, decentralized system built entirely on goodwill. The burden was immense, but so too was the reward. Volunteers wrote later of the unforgettable sight of children arriving safely, of small hands gripping theirs with trust, of eyes wide with both fear and relief. For many of the volunteers, those moments justified the exhaustion, the frustration, and the countless bureaucratic battles. They had done something tangible in a world where so many felt powerless. Still, the challenges never disappeared. Each new transport meant another round of fundraising, another mountain of paperwork, another set of negotiations with skeptical officials. The looming war added constant tension. Would the borders close before the next train departed? Would Britain change its policy under pressure? Volunteers lived with these uncertainties, knowing that any delay could mean lives lost. And yet, despite the odds, they persisted. The RCM, alongside the Quakers and countless other small organizations, became an extraordinary example of civilian mobilization. They showed that rescue did not require government initiative nor military intervention. It required determination, organization, and above all, humanity. What is often forgotten today is just how fragile the Kindertransport was. It could have failed at any stage, in Parliament, in the ministries, at the borders, on the trains, but it did not fail because civilians refused to let it fail. Behind the photographs of children stepping onto British soil lies the invisible labour of thousands of hands, writing, organising, welcoming. This is where the true heroism of the Kindertransport resides, not in grand gestures, but in the painstaking, everyday work of volunteers who refused to turn away. When the trains of the Kindertransport pulled into Britain, the children had escaped danger, but their journeys were far from over. Safety did not automatically mean belonging. Each child, with a tag pinned to their clothing and a suitcase holding the last remnants of their old life, needed a home, a family, and a chance at a future. This was where another layer of unsung heroes emerged, the foster families of Britain, ordinary men and women who opened their doors to strangers at a time of uncertainty. The scale of this undertaking was enormous. Thousands of children arrived within a matter of months. The refugee children's movement, already stretched thin with paperwork and logistics, now faced the challenge of finding safe homes. Britain had no precedent for such an operation. There were no state-run centres prepared for long-term care, no official agencies ready to manage foster placements. Instead, the solution came from the public, families from across the country who volunteered, often with little idea of what they were undertaking. The motivations were as varied as the families themselves. Some were driven by religious duty, inspired by their churches, synagogues, or Quaker meetings. Others felt a moral obligation after seeing images of the violence in Germany and Austria. For some, it was a sense of patriotism, believing that protecting innocent children was part of Britain's role in resisting tyranny. And there were also those who simply wanted companionship, particularly couples who had no children of their own. What united them all was the willingness to take in a child they had never met, from a culture they did not fully understand, speaking a language many could not communicate in. It was an act of trust on both sides, the family offering their home and the child, often against their will, being asked to trust strangers with their future. The stories that followed were as complex as human relationships themselves. For some children, placement was smooth. They found warmth and care, and though they never forgot their parents left behind, they grew to see their foster families as a second home. Others struggled. Misunderstandings of culture, food, religion, and language created barriers. A child who refused to eat pork or who observed unfamiliar traditions might puzzle or frustrate a British family unaccustomed to Jewish customs. Over time, some children lost their cultural roots, while others clung to them stubbornly, marking a line of separation in the household. One example often remembered is that of foster families in rural England who had never encountered Jewish customs before. For them, learning to respect dietary needs or religious observances was a steep learning curve. Yet many adjusted with patience, and in doing so, they expanded their own understanding of the world. These households became microcosms of cultural exchange, where survival depended not only on shelter, but on acceptance. There were, of course, difficulties. Not every placement succeeded. Some children endured indifference, or worse, neglect. The RCM monitored placements as best as it could, sending inspectors to check on conditions, but with thousands of children spread across the country, oversight was limited. In some cases, children were moved multiple times, each shift reopening wounds of loss and displacement. And yet, for all the hardship, the system worked. The majority of children were cared for, educated, and given a chance to rebuild their lives. Britain's willingness to host them remains one of the most remarkable aspects of the Kindertransport story. The generosity was not confined to individual families. Institutions also stepped forward. Schools took in refugee children, adapting classes to accommodate new languages and cultural differences. Farms in the countryside became group homes where teenagers learned agricultural skills. Hostels were established in cities, sometimes run by charities or community organizations, offering temporary shelter until permanent homes were found. Even small villages with limited resources found ways to contribute, pooling together to support one or two children. For the children themselves, the experience was bittersweet. Relief at being safe often collided with grief at separation. Letters from parents were treasured, read again and again until the paper frayed. For many, those letters stopped abruptly in 1941 or 1942, when deportations to ghettos and camps sealed the fate of their families. Foster parents sometimes found themselves in the impossible position of trying to explain why no letters came anymore. There were moments of resilience, too. Children picked up English quickly, often within months, and adapted to British schools. Some excelled academically, later becoming doctors, artists, or scientists who contributed greatly to Britain and beyond. Their successes were the legacy of both their determination and the quiet support of foster families who gave them stability in the darkest years. It is important to remember that fostering was not always easy for the families either. Wartime Britain was itself under strain. By 1940, rationing had begun. Bombing raids threatened cities. Fathers were conscripted, leaving mothers to manage households alone. To take on an extra child during such times was no small act of generosity. Every slice of bread shared, every blanket offered, was a sacrifice, and yet thousands of families made that choice even when their own futures were uncertain. The diversity of hosts reflected the breadth of British society. Wealthy families in London hosted children in comfortable townhouses, while working-class households in industrial cities squeezed them into small flats. Some families could afford tutors and summer holidays, others only the basics. But in both extremes, the underlying gesture was the same, an offer of shelter when it was needed most. The long-term impact of these placements extended beyond the war. Many of the children who grew up in Britain under the care of foster families remained in the country for the rest of their lives. They became British citizens, built careers, and started families of their own. In later years, reunions between Kindertransport survivors and their foster families revealed the deep bonds that had formed, often lasting decades. For the volunteers of the RCM, the placement of each child was both an achievement and a responsibility. They were acutely aware that lives hung in the balance. A home was more than just a roof. It was a chance at normalcy in a world turned upside down. They continued their work throughout the war, constantly recruiting new families, mediating conflicts, and doing their best to match children with households where they might thrive. The foster families, too, became part of a larger story they did not always recognize at the time. By offering a bed, a meal, and care, they were not just helping one child. They were preserving a generation. They were ensuring that culture, memory, and human potential would not be extinguished by tyranny. In the end, their quiet acts of kindness stood as powerful counterpoints to the brutality unfolding across Europe. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Kindertransport was not just about trains, visas, and organizations. It was about living rooms and kitchens, about ordinary families who decided that when faced with a choice between indifference and compassion, they would choose compassion. The children who survived because of them carried those memories into adulthood, never forgetting the strangers who had once become their family. By the time the war officially began in September 1939, the children of the Kindertransport were scattered across Britain, each living in homes that ranged from the crowded row houses of Manchester to quiet villages in the Cotswolds. For many, the initial relief of having escaped persecution gave way to the reality of a nation now at war. Britain itself was under siege, and the safety they had found was not as absolute as it once seemed. Yet despite the looming threat, the resilience of these young refugees and the communities that sheltered them became an enduring testament to human adaptability. The outbreak of war meant restrictions and adjustments for everyone. Air raid drills became routine, blackout curtains hung over windows, and gas masks were carried as a matter of daily life. For the refugee children, these precautions were both strange and familiar. They had fled from bombs and violence, yet here they were again, preparing for the possibility of attacks. The Blitz would not begin until 1940, but the atmosphere of tension was already heavy. In schools across Britain, the presence of refugee children reshaped classrooms. Teachers had to adapt lessons for those who spoke little or no English. Some children thrived, mastering the language quickly and rising to the top of their classes. Others struggled, haunted by memories of separation and loss. Still, the effort to integrate them was remarkable. Classmates shared pencils, whispered translations, and offered small gestures of kindness that made the unfamiliar world less intimidating. For the organizers of the refugee children's movement and their allies, the beginning of the war brought fresh challenges. The government grew cautious about foreigners on British soil, and the refugee children, though innocent, were swept into broader debates about enemy aliens. Activists like Eleanor Rathbone worked tirelessly in Parliament to defend their rights, reminding officials and the public that these children were victims of the very regime Britain was now fighting. Without such voices, suspicion might have undermined the entire effort. Even as the war tightened its grip, the foster families persevered. Rationing meant that every household had to make sacrifices. Sugar, butter, meat, and later even bread were limited. Taking in an extra child added strain, but families found ways to adapt. Many refugee children learned to tend vegetable gardens, helping to cultivate the victory gardens that supplemented household food supplies. Others learned to keep chickens or rabbits, small tasks that made them feel useful and part of the family. The arrival of the Blitz in September 1940 tested the courage of everyone in Britain. Night after night, sirens wailed as German bombers targeted cities. Families huddled in shelters, unsure if their homes would survive until morning. For the refugee children, it was a cruel echo of the dangers they had fled. But there was a difference. This time, they were not alone. They had surrogate families beside them, holding their hands in the dark, reassuring them with whispered words of comfort. In London, William Sansom and other civil defence volunteers fought fires and rescued civilians, often seeing refugee children among the survivors. Their presence reminded many Britons why the struggle mattered. To shield the innocent, to give them a chance at life, was a cause that resonated deeply during those terrifying nights. The shared experience of the Blitz created bonds that transcended background and origin. Refugee children became part of Britain's collective endurance. Yet the emotional toll was heavy. Letters from Europe grew fewer and fewer. Many children clung to the hope that their parents might one day join them, but by 1941, the silence from the continent was deafening. Some foster families tried to shield children from the truth, while others chose to be honest. Either way, the grief was profound, though often carried quietly. These children matured quickly, shaped by loss and survival. The war years also brought opportunities for older refugee children to contribute directly. Teenagers volunteered in civil defense, hospitals and farms. Some joined the military when they came of age, fighting for the country that had given them refuge. Their loyalty was not taken for granted. It was born of gratitude and the determination to resist the forces that had uprooted their lives. Among the organizers, the workload never ceased. Bertha Bracey and her colleagues in the Quaker network continued advocating, finding placements, and raising funds. Churches organized clothing drives. Communities pooled resources to ensure that no child was left without shoes or coats during the harsh winters. These acts of collective support, though sometimes small, sustained thousands of lives. Despite the hardships, stories of joy persisted. Refugee children celebrated birthdays with makeshift cakes, sang songs in English alongside traditional tunes from their homelands. and forged lifelong friendships with British peers. Some even fell in love with the country itself, adopting its traditions as their own. It was not uncommon for a refugee child to speak of feeling both grief for the family left behind and gratitude for the new life unfolding before them. The cultural exchange enriched Britain as well. Foster families learned new customs, discovered unfamiliar foods, and grew in empathy through their daily interactions. In the process, the children influenced their hosts, leaving traces of their heritage in communities that might otherwise have remained insular. Through it all, the allies of Sir Nicholas, the activists, the families, the volunteers, the politicians, remained steadfast. They had not rescued children simply to abandon them once war broke out. They continued their mission under bombardment, under rationing, under constant uncertainty. Their determination was proof that the true strength of the Kindertransport lay not in a single figure, but in the collective spirit of those who refused to let innocence be destroyed. By the later years of the war, many of the Kinder had grown into young adults. They carried with them the resilience of survival and the lessons of adaptation. Their experiences were both a burden and a gift, shaping them into individuals who would leave an indelible mark on post-war society. Whether they became scholars, artists, professionals, or parents, they bore within them the legacy of a rescue that was as much about compassion as it was about logistics. In the shadows of war, when Britain itself teetered on the edge of devastation, the lives saved through the Kindertransport became symbols of what could be achieved when ordinary people acted together. Sir Nicholas Winton may have become the face of the movement in later years, but behind him stood a nation of allies who shared in the triumph and bore the responsibility of giving children not only survival, but the chance to live, to grow, and to dream again. As the war came to its devastating conclusion in 1945, the refugee children who had arrived years earlier on the Kindertransport faced an uncertain future once again. The guns fell silent, the skies cleared of bombers, and Europe began to take stock of what had been lost. For the Kinder, the question that lingered was one they had carried since the day they left their homelands. What of my family? Some children rushed to write letters or seek records, clinging to the hope that parents or siblings had survived. A small number discovered reunions that defied the odds. Against the tide of destruction, they found a mother, a father, or a brother still alive. But for the overwhelming majority, the silence was permanent. Their parents, extended families, and neighbors had been swallowed by the Holocaust. The bitter truth, slowly and painfully revealed, was that the Kindertransport had not just given them safety, it had, in many cases, saved them from being the last surviving thread of their family line. In this grief, the foster families, the organizers, and the communities that had cared for them became even more important. They were no longer simply hosts. They were the only families many of these children had left. Bonds that had begun out of necessity deepened into lifelong connections. Foster mothers became true mothers. Foster brothers and sisters became siblings, not by blood, but by experience. The work of the allies of Sir Nicholas did not end with victory in Europe. Many of the organizers dedicated themselves to helping the Kinder rebuild their lives as permanent residents of Britain. The refugee children's movement transitioned into supporting education, job placements, and citizenship applications. Quaker organizations continued to provide spiritual and practical support, ensuring that the children did not face the post-war years alone. Eleanor Rathbone and her allies in Parliament remained fierce advocates until their last days, reminding the government of its responsibility toward those it had saved. The children themselves began to contribute to Britain's recovery. Some entered universities, fueled by the opportunity denied to their parents. Others became apprentices, workers, or volunteers in rebuilding shattered cities. Many eventually married, started families, and wove themselves permanently into the fabric of British society. Their successes were not just personal triumphs, but living proof of the wisdom and humanity of those who had fought to bring them here. The legacy of these children extended far beyond Britain. Some emigrated to the United States, Canada, or Israel, carrying with them both the trauma of their displacement and the gratitude for the second chance they had been given. They became doctors, teachers, writers, engineers, leaders in every field. Many openly credited their survival and their ability to contribute to the world, to the ordinary Britons who had taken them in. In the decades that followed, Sir Nicholas Winton's story came to light, capturing the imagination of millions. Yet those who truly understood the Kindertransport knew that his work was just one part of a vast collective effort. Without the activists who lobbied Parliament, without the clerks who processed endless visas, without the Quakers who organized reception centers, without the families who opened their doors, the trains from Europe would have meant little. The miracle of the Kindertransport was never the work of one man. It was the achievement of thousands of unsung heroes whose names rarely appear in history books. Commemorations in later years tried to rectify this. Survivors, now elderly, spoke of the families who raised them, the teachers who encouraged them, the volunteers who welcomed them off the trains with warm coats and hot meals. They remembered the patience of those who taught them English, the tenderness of foster parents who comforted them when the letters from home stopped coming. These testimonies highlighted the truth that compassion, spread across countless small acts, can change the course of history. The allies of Sir Nicholas left behind more than just rescued lives. They left behind a model of what ordinary people can achieve when faced with extraordinary evil. They showed that one does not need to hold power or fame to make an impact. A teacher who offered a desk, a farmer who gave a bed, a politician who signed a letter, a volunteer who worked by candlelight filling out forms. All of these actions combined to save nearly 10,000 children. The legacy continues to resonate in modern times. When discussions arise about refugees fleeing war or persecution, the Kindertransport is often remembered as a moral benchmark. The question is posed: if Britain could take in thousands of children on the eve of its own darkest hours, what can we do today? The story challenges future generations not to retreat into indifference, but to see in each displaced child the same potential for resilience, for contribution, for humanity. For the survivors, their memories remain both a burden and a blessing. Many still recall the fear of separation, the pain of loss, and the uncertainty of arriving in a strange land. But they also remember the kindness that met them at every turn, the welcoming hand, the open door, the shared meal. That kindness, multiplied across a nation, allowed them not only to survive, but to flourish. The Kindertransport reminds us that history is not only shaped by generals and battles, but by quiet acts of conscience. While the world descended into war, a network of civilians stood up and said, "We will not let these children perish." They became the allies of Sir Nicholas, not his assistants or footnotes, but equal partners in one of the most extraordinary humanitarian efforts of the 20th century. Their work endures in every life that was saved, in every grandchild of the Kinder who now walks the earth, in every story passed down at family tables. And in the end, perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all, proof that compassion, even in the smallest hands, can ripple outward and defeat the darkest forces of history.